Mediocrity 4 is now on Patreon, link in the description. Jojo's Bizarre Adventure neither deserves nor needs a lengthy introduction. This is the almighty Dio, and no, Stardust Crusaders does not make him better. It may in fact make him worse. The first two parts of Jojo's Bizarre Adventure didn't feel like anything special. It wasn't bad, but it was a far cry from the influential masterpiece I was promised. Nebulous glowy hand magic, a plot right out of Castlevania, and a pair of boring villains really held this show back. But things would improve. Join me next time when I talk about the story arcs that lifted Jojo from an action anime of strictly average quality to something more. Next time I'll be talking about Stardust Crusaders and Diamond is Unbreakable. I'm Mediocrity 4. Stay bizarre. One thing I like about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is how lax the fandom is. It reminds me of the Dragon Ball fandom. They love the show in spite of its flaws, or sometimes because of them, and they don't outright ignore them, unless you're trying to criticize Dio. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stardust Crusaders is a completely different beast from the previous two arcs, and it's an improvement in every single regard. The most obvious difference is the introduction of stands and the downplaying of Haman, the generic glowy hand magic of the previous two arcs that I didn't care for. I never liked Haman because it seemed to be able to do whatever the plot needed it without rhyme or reason, yet everyone except the generic protagonist only used it in super specific ways. This made even the better fights less dynamic and more a series of ass-pulls and one-upsmanships like the latter parts of Naruto. Stands are just more creative at their core, fighting spirits with super specific stats, power sets, limitations, and counterplay options. I do wish the naming convention stayed consistent though. At first they're all tarot cards, then Egyptian gods, what is with Japan's fascination with Egypt? And then in future parts they're all musical references, which are more tolerable in these parts, namely because they're references to things that actually do exist in the world. No more ancient Aztec demigods named after a popular rock band that wouldn't exist until the 1970s. Now you get bodyguards named Vanilla Ice because everyone is allowed to like at least one goofy white rapper. Go ninja, go! For me it's Macklemore. Cut the bullshit, get off my mother! Naming conventions still don't mean anything, but at least they're references to things that the characters actually know. Stands also lead to a winning formula. Formula is very important for a serialized show or comic. A formula can be subverted. Even shows that don't have an episodic formula need some kind of formula. In Stardust Crusaders, that formula is arrive at pit stop, weird things start happening, it's the work of an enemy stand, figure out the stand's weakness, find out who's best equipped, and exploit said weakness. Not every fight is great, and there are some genuinely bad ones in there, but that's bound to happen when you have a couple dozen fights in the span of 48 episodes. So I'll call this JoJo's kinda bizarre adventure. Emphasis on adventure. The only time this formula doesn't work is when the main character Jojo saves the day because his stand power boils down to hit it harder, which is extremely cathartic, especially with the ora 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 and the Magnum truck sound design I mentioned in the previous video. But there's so many creative battles that most of this feels like a downgrade, and sadly that includes the final fight. The characters are also much more dynamic and likable. Jojo is a good lead for the more bizarre episodes, which are few and far between. They're there, but not all the time. He's a stoic artist inspired by Clint Eastwood, and it works. Joseph is also back, but now he has likable characters to play off of instead of Caesar, Lisa, and Suzy Q. Because of that, he's allowed to be the Master Roshi of the Crusaders. Then you have the tactical and dutiful Kakyoin, the bravado-fueled Polnareff, and the spiritual core and stand expert Abdal. And later you get Iggy the dog because that's exactly what the show needed. The show has its faults, but they're not as deal-breaking as the awful lead heroes and villains of Phantom Blood and Battle Tendency. They're small, like, how is this baby able to have such a powerful stand, but Holly's stand threatens to kill her? How do the assassins always know where the crew are going to be? Isn't Dio wanting Haman blood like Superman eating kryptonite? Speaking of which, where did all Dio's vampire powers go? Dio really is the worst. Conceptually, he's better in this arc. Unlike in Phantom Blood, he has a good reason to stay in his castle and use assassins in his stead. Also, his absolute mental ineptitude is what ends up being his downfall. Dio is so absolutely stupid, like actually mentally handicapped, that he makes the paint-swilling morons at the Verge look like geniuses of their profession. I want these JoJo videos to be spoiler-free, but I have to talk about that ending, so skip to the timestamp on the screen to avoid spoilers. I really hate the last 3 or so episodes. It spits in the face of every strength the show has had. Jotaro pulls another power out of his ass just because Star Platinum and the world kinda look the same. And from there it turns into the time stop equivalent of hit 'em harder! Where somehow human Jotaro Kujo manages to beat Super Vampire Dio by being magically better at using a power he just pulled out of his ass. And then it continues to be dumb from there with everything surrounding the fight and how it's paced. If not for that ending, JoJo's Part 3 would get an 8 out of 10, but because that final climactic fight also happens to be the absolute worst fight in the entire franchise, it cost the show an entire point. Stardust Crusaders gets a 7 out of 10. I had a lot more thoughts on Stardust Crusaders than I thought I would, so I'm going to hold off on talking about Diamond is Unbreakable until a future video. Until that time, I'm Mediocrity4, stay bizarre.